On the morning of her wedding, Sarah Sterling woke to a light she could not account for, a pallid, almost comet-like spill across the glass of her penthouse that seemed to lean in, as if the city outside were holding its breath. The chandeliers above the salon caught the pail and broke it into a dozen thin knives. The knives cut across her reflection and left her looking at herself in fragments. The practiced smile she wore for cameras, the private fissure she had learned to hide. It was the kind of morning that felt public even when the curtains were drawn. Someone, or something, felt like an audience. She moved with the economy of ritual that had mapped her life. A brush through hair that had been smoothed and set the night before, a practiced angle of the chin, a hand sliding along the seam of a gown folded on a chaise. Outside, the city prepared its own rites, drivers waiting on the curb, florists arranging the last sprigs of white, and a fleet of pressed men in suits who belonged to committees and credit lines. Inside, her mother rehearsed the schedule over the phone, voice a practiced metronome. From the bedroom, Sarah could hear, beneath her mother's clipped syllables, beneath the soft laughter of bridesmaids and the distant hum of cameras, the faintest, most intimate sound. The low, steady thrum that had always been with her when Alex entered a room. It was the sound of someone listening. "Are you all right?" her mother asked when she came in, trying to fold consolation into a smile that bore the weary polish of a woman who had spent a life converting questions into answers. Sarah let the question be a stone dropped into a quiet pool. Ripples, then calm. "I'm fine," she said. The words had weight. She felt them land and seal, as if the truth of them could be sewn into the fabric of the morning. The wedding was to be a public thing, a cathedral rented for effect, a guest list curated to increase value rather than intimacy. Sarah had always been aware of her life as a ledger, appearances that built reputations, reputations that opened doors, doors that kept certain persons from ever seeing the inside of her heart. Alex James had not been such a doorswap at first. He had been a curiosity, an anomaly that fit her appetite for mystery without threatening the scaffolding she had built. Wealthy enough to be useful, unobtrusive enough to be charming, strange enough to be worthy of a story. They had met in Zurich, at a charity gala whose rafters had been all light and glass. Sarah remembered the first time she noticed him not as a face, but as a mechanism. When everyone else gasped at the introduction, Mr. Vale, philanthropist and collector, she had seen instead the way his hands rested on the back of a chair, the way his eyes measured distance like a cartographer. He did not reach for the applause. He accepted attention as if it were given by currency, not by heat. Later, in the quieter hours, he had bent close and said something small and careless, a joke about old stone and newer reputations, and the sound of his voice had been the most dangerous thing she had encountered in years. There had been tenderness there. There had also been distance. They became a story before they became a couple. They attended dinners across cities, Paris, London, Geneva, and each appearance was a new chapter in a profile piece. Sarah learned to wear him like a brooch, a glint that increased her own purchase. In private, there were moments of startling intimacy that contradicted the public persona. He knew things she had not told the press, the name of a favorite pianist she no longer listened to, the exact number of steps in the stair of her childhood home. Those small recognitions built trust, the soft kind that is less like a foundation and more like a thread. And then there were the small unmendings that refused a tidy narrative. Once, in a hotel in Paris, she had taken his hand and felt it as if it were a sculptor's specimen, cool and dry, colder than the room. She had watched his pulse and found nothing there, and for a moment she had turned the private question outward like a badge. He had laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Aren't you dramatic?" Later he admitted, with a voice that had the quality of a hand closing slowly around a delicate object, that his sleep had begun to favor long hours awake, that he sometimes found himself adrift in histories that were not his own. Not ghosts, not quite. More like memories that arrived uninvited. Sarah cataloged these details the way a curator keeps a ledger. They were anomalies, footnotes to a larger story. She liked the footnotes. They were interesting. They felt like evidence that life still had the capacity to surprise her. On the drive to the cathedral, the town folded away into an older geometry. Stone facades, the long line of benches waiting like silent musketeers. The car's air smelled of citrus and the faint chemical sweetness of the gown that would soon be pressed tight across her shoulders. She watched themselves in the window glass, the face of a woman about to become something else, flanked in reflections by columns and sky. Alex rode beside her, an island in a tailored suit, his hand resting on his knee, fingers loose as if they were keeping a small private map. He did not look at her. He looked beyond, toward the cathedral, toward an absent point that lay folded in his own inward attention. They arrived to the sound the rest of the world would later call drama. A hush as guests were seated, a murmur of cameras. Sarah stepped into the stone cool as a wine cellar. She walked like someone conducting measurement. Each step had been practiced 100 times, every hem adjusted for the magnified angles. The cathedral's nave swallowed sound and spit back a reverberant hush. Stained glass slashed colors over faces, and the air smelled like frankincense and old wood, like years stored in a building that had been used as a container for other people's oaths. She heard a small sound then, a disturbance that was not the organ or the shifting of silk, a soft metallic hum, as if the stones themselves carried a tired note. Sarah's chest tightened, not with fear but with attention. For a beat she felt watched in a way she had not felt since childhood, not by cameras or neighbors but by something older. It might have been the cathedral's stone ears. It might have been her own mind tuning to the narrative in which she had agreed to play the part of bride. The officiant, an understated man with a voice meant for pageant and not for intimacy, began the formalities. Words floated through the nave, the sort meant to translate private intent into public law. Sarah could feel the press of eyes like wind against a window. She could feel her mother's presence like a compass behind her, steady and expectant. Alex's hand found hers. It was colder than the air, but the cold bore no cruelty. It was a stillness that had learned restraint. For the first time that morning, Sarah's practiced smile faltered. She felt that hum again, a vibration beneath the ribs of the cathedral that seemed to sync with the back of her throat. She pictured a thin thread, invisible and bright, tying them. The picture came unbidden, and with it an ancient private dread, the image of movement that did not stop. He looked at her then, and his gaze was not the camera's lens. It was close and unbearably honest. He had rehearsed 1,000 faces to hide the small cracks. He had, as she had. But now, under the cathedral's light, there was only the man who had carried histories long enough to make time itself an inconvenient burden. "Sarah," he said, voice low, and the sound moved like a hand across glass. "Before we say these vows in front of everyone, there is something I must tell you. It will change what you choose." The crowd leaned forward as if drawn by the sentence. A rustle of silk moved like a wave. Sarah's heart quickened not with panic, but with the lucid, piercing attention she had always prized. She had a moment, of course. There is always a thin, sharp moment before life divides into before and after. And in that hollowed instant, she could have chosen 1,000 different quiet things. She could have laughed it off. She could have asked him to speak later. But the space between a secret revealed and consent given is where truth lives, and Sarah had spent her life practicing truth. Alex was not theatrical. He did not unfold a tale with the care of someone crafting tragedy. He spoke directly, with the economy of one who had for centuries measured the weight of words. "I am not what you think," he said. "I am not a man in the ordinary sense. I am something sustained by a fracture in time that I did not make and cannot mend. I have endured centuries. I have tried, God knows I have tried, to keep myself apart, to be careful with others. But that fracture, when two lives are bound in the way vows bind, will look for balance. It will demand it. If you marry me, Sarah, your life will move differently. For each year I have outside, someone near me must hasten within. That is the truth of what I am." The words articulated into the air, beautiful and terrible. They roped themselves around the choir's voice and tugged at fabric. In the pews, a woman let out a small, shocked sound. Somewhere behind Sarah, a phone camera tilted. Her mother, whose composing instinct sometimes failed at private tremors, pressed her lips together until a hard line formed. Sarah had known him long enough to recognize the tenderness behind his confession. He did not speak like a charlatan trying to seduce sympathy. He did not speak like a beast issuing threats. He spoke like a man who had carried ache and, in carrying, had learned that the cost of closeness could be a toll paid in the currency of another's life. "Is this blackmail?" someone hissed from the crowd. The accusation tasted small, shrill. Alex closed his eyes briefly. When he looked at Sarahi again, the look was almost apologetic. "If telling you is the price of your choice," he said, "then it is a price I will pay willingly. I would rather you knew than be bound by ignorance." Silence pressed until Sarah could hear only her own small, precise breaths. The question the title would later haunt the margins with, love or deception, arrived like a bell at the center of her chest. It was not an abstract. It had the shape of her life and the lives of those she loved. Love, in her world, had always been a contract, a currency where every favor returned with interest. Deception was a thing that lived in the gloss of certain marriages, in the quiet rearrangements behind gleaming doors. Here, the question had a new, more dangerous angle. Was this love if it meant taking from someone else the measure of a life? She could withdraw. She could say nothing and let the standard ceremonies continue, then make a choice in private later. But consent, she had learned in other negotiations, was often rendered impotent by the weight of place and spectacle. The cathedral, the lenses, the cameras waiting to transform shock into narrative, each had the power to erode the fine calculus of a private decision. If she accepted now, even quietly, she would be consenting under the architecture of fame, which had its own gravity. "Do you understand," Alex asked, "that binding is exactly that? It is consent made into a thing that will not unmake itself. The process will look for balance. It will take compensation in the rhythm of life. I know the cruelty of this. I know how monstrous it sounds. I only ask that your decision be your own." The officiant shifted, the ritual face returning for a moment like an actor remembering a cue. There were whispers. The cameras, clever and unblinking, were already focusing hearts and eyes into lenses set to chronicle rupture. Sarah felt her tongue thick as wax. For a strange second she saw herself as someone else might, a woman in a white dress at the center of a moral problem too large to be reduced to an anecdote. The ledger of life rose, balanced with impossible weights. 100 years of an unfamiliar breath on one side, on the other her own uncluttered time. The equation produced no neat solution. Her voice, when she found it, had the small, calm chisel she used in boardrooms and charity galas. "If there is harm in binding," she said, "I will not allow it to be something done to someone who has not chosen it with eyes open." It was not a denial. It was a refusal to be a commodity. She had never craved martyrdom. She had never wanted to be the sort of woman who defined herself by sacrifice, but neither would she be a ledger entry in a bargain that asked her life for another's gain. There was tenderness on Alex's face, grief that had the weight of long habit, and then, impossibly, relief trembled there too, as if some long-missed fidelity had been repaid. The cathedral's hush broke like glass. Half the guests rose before Sarah had quite finished, as if motion were a correction. Her mother's face had gone pale, not with anger, but with the collapse of an expectation she had practiced her whole career. Cameras snapped with hungry noise, and a man from security moved forward with the rigid, polite aggression of those trained to remove inconveniences. Alex took her hand, not as an owner but as a supplicant. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said in a voice small enough to be private despite the audience. "I told you because you deserved—" "I deserve my agency," Sarah said. In the sudden chaos, her words were a small, clear instrument. There was shouting, quickly fed into a body of rumor. The groom had confessed a condition. The bride had walked. The press, who had been promised a spectacle of luxury and now tasted something grislier, threaded themselves through condolences like flies. Sarah felt her skin buzzing with the sensation of being observed in a way that would calcify into headlines. Love or deception? The socialite's alarming discovery at the altar. She imagined the phrasing with the grim humor of someone who had seen her life filtered into tabloid gold, and felt rage at the thought that one man's truth about himself could be so easily weaponized. Security escorted them out with gentle force. Voices collided, questions, the clack of shoes on stone, and outside the cathedral the winter air hit like a slap. Someone from the press shouted a question about whether the ceremony would continue. A friend muttered something about indecency. Sarah's mother, who normally moved with the spring of a woman who had long since forgiven the world for the slights of modesty, placed a hand on Sarah's arm with fingers that trembled more than a woman used to control would allow. Alex did not speak as the crowd pressed. He looked at Sarah with an expression that asked for something, and in that glance there was both confession and the aching need for forgiveness. She had, in that opt-out, exposed him to shame and to the public shudder of curiosity. She had also, in that small refusal, refused to be used. The two acts were not contradictory. Love had always been complicated in her life. They left the cathedral in the separate absurdity of a new narrative. Photographers circled them with professional courtesy. Reporters tried to shape what had been an intimate admission into a story. A man in a gray coat followed them, phone lifted like a cudgel. Sarah felt the city's appetite for scandal unfurling behind her as if it were another creature living off the cathedral's breath. For a moment in the car there was only the low humming that had accompanied them since the first confession. It moved in the back of Sarah's teeth, a vibration she could not quite locate. Alex's hand found hers again. It was an old instinct to take the small things people offered, glances, touches, small unlooked-for kindnesses, and treat them as gifts. Sarah allowed him the touch but kept the rest of herself folded. "Thank you," he said suddenly, and the word was odd because it was not gratitude for being spared but for being told. "Thank you for hearing me." She did not answer. There were things to be negotiated, the press to be managed, statements to be crafted, protective statements that would turn his confession into something socially legible. Even so, Sarah knew that the real negotiation would not occur in a press conference or in a lawyer's office. It would take place in rooms where privacy could be purchased and where the cost was not money, but the slow alteration of a life. When they returned to her penthouse, the city spread below like a pool of ledger entries. Windows blinked like eyes that had seen them and stored the image. The staff had been briefed to keep a neat silence. Sarah's mother had retreated to the kitchen with the brittle calm of someone unaccustomed to losing control of an event. Friends had offered quick consolations, then retreated, their comfort awkward as a garment that didn't fit. In the quiet of her dressing room, Sarah looked in the mirror. The gown lay in its folds, untroubled by the day's drama. She imagined the headlines and, beneath them, the ledger of possibilities. To marry him and alter the cadence of her life. To walk away and retain the ordinary arithmetic of years. To attempt some other, impossible arrangement. Her hands trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with adrenaline. They trembled because this was the first time in a long while she had been asked to choose without the benefit of a curated public narrative. Alex stood in the doorway, the light from the city feathering his profile. He did not intrude. He simply looked at her, as if she were the book he had waited centuries to read, but had always feared to open. "You should not have told them," she said finally, not as reproach but as observation. "You should have let me consent privately." He nodded, an old sadness folding through him. "I thought I could spare you the choice," he said. "I thought if I could keep us small." "You thought," Sarah interrupted, "that the truth could be something you carried alone. You do not get to decide that for me." There was a moment of silence. Then he did something she had never seen him do publicly. He went to her, knelt as if the cathedral had unfolded in reverse, and took her hands in both of his. The action was neither theatrical nor groveling. It was the small, human thing of a man hoping to be seen. "Tell me," he whispered, "what do you want from me now?" She could list practicalities, apologies, statements to the press, the removal of his name from invitations, an erasure from the public calendar. But the more dangerous, private question throbbed beneath the practicalities. What would she ask of a man who had confessed that his life was lived across the cracks of time? Would she demand his absence, his disappearance, his containment? Or would she force herself to imagine a different bargain, one she could consent to on her terms? Transparency, she said, and honesty. No more surprises, no half-truths that make me into an account to be balanced. He agreed. You will have it. I will live with whatever you ask. The line between custody and coercion thinned and thickened like a tide. Sarah recognized with the clarity of someone who had negotiated contracts for the benefit of others that promises were a kind of currency. Anyone could promise. The question always came down to enforceability and moral cost. How to ensure that a promise meant more than a word. They spoke until the city outside leaned toward night and the penthouse lamps threw pools of amber across the rugs. Guests called in, leaving voice messages that tried to make sense of the event. The press prepared drafts under bright lights of their own. Sarah fielded a few calls with the muted politeness of someone who had learned to let public narratives be forged without her fingerprints on their metal. Later, when everyone had left and the apartment bent back into its private geometry, Sarah found her gaze drawn to the high mirror in the hallway. She examined her wrist, small veins under the skin like thin ink lines, and noticed a faint shimmer she had not seen before, a hairline that ran like a seam from the soft pad of her inner wrist toward the elbow. For an absurd moment she suspected a scratch from the cathedral's benches. She held the skin up to the light and found, beneath the flesh, an almost unseeable thread of light that hummed in the same low register she had felt all day. "Did you see that?" she asked without thinking, turning to Alex. He came closer, and, without touching, let his eyes pass over the shimmer as if reading the fine print of an old debt. "You will see things," he said softly. "If you are near me, the balance will seek its own measure." She did not flinch when he said it. That, more than the confession at the cathedral, was the real revelation. A metaphysical accounting had already begun to inventory her life. The seam on her skin was small, barely a detail against the architecture of her body, but it carried the ominous geometry of consequence. "How soon?" she asked, the question a knife honed on a whetstone of calm. "It depends on the gravity of the binding." His voice was careful. He was choosing words the way a man might pick among bandages. "If we had stood at the altar and given consent, it would have been immediate in its full force. But there are smaller effects, traces, echoes, that do not require legal formality. Proximity matters. Being near me has its own cost." She thought of years, her own and the ones she could trade. She imagined a middle-aged photograph where she had been hurried past, such that the lines on her face were misread as elegance. She imagined grandchildren she might never meet, ordinary breakfasts she might miss because time, quickened in small increments, made certain things arrive sooner. "My life is not a ledger to be balanced against centuries," she said. The words were not dramatic, they were simply accurate. "If the price of your life is mine, I won't author what amounts to a theft." He swallowed. "I do not want to take from you," he said. "You must know that to be true." Their conversation was private, but it carried the same gravity as an international treaty. Sarah's sense of self, trained to weigh public consequence, now turned inward, measuring the soft geometries of a bodily life that could not be replaced by charity boards or tax returns. She thought of the children she might have chosen to bear, or chosen not to. She thought of the small, unremarkable pleasures that were the right of ordinary mortality, the ache of living, the consolation of finish. When she finally went to sleep, it was with a kind of professional exhaustion that was not unlike grief. The city below hummed with speculation. Cameras had gone to their editors. Headlines would not rest. She slept fitfully, dreams spooling like film, a younger version of herself wandering corridors of a house that seemed to rearrange itself, doors opening into centuries. Alex appeared intermittently in those dreams, always containing the same expression. Centuries lived with a single, repeated regret. Morning came with a thin slice of light that found the same place on the floorboards to which the chandeliers had thrown knives. Sarah rose, went through the motions of the day, meetings with advisors, calls from friends, and in every small action the thought lingered like a shadow. She had refused at the altar, and the world had heard both confessions and denials. The public story would calcify into a shape her mother could spin into salvage or into scandal, depending on how much capital was needed. But the private story, where the seam on her wrist hummed with an inscrutable light, was the one that would require tending. Alex came by in the afternoon. He entered through a side door, not the grand entrance, and moved like a man practicing small courtesies. Careful with thresholds, aware of how his presence occupied space. Sarah had arranged a private lunch. They ate quietly at a table by the window. The city looked on, busy and indifferent. She watched him as he ate, and every bite he took seemed to age the room by half a second. The reporter's pen at the cathedral had turned his confession into a curse. Between them, in the quiet, it was a human plea. "Can this be reversed?" she asked, the question not rhetorical. "It can with complete sincerity," he said. "But sincerity must be both parties and enough to undo a long binding. I have spent my life trying to keep at arm's length precisely because even a small slip could become a chain." "You said binding is consent made into a thing that will not unmake itself," she replied. "If I implicated myself, if I had pledged my life for your continuity, how would you live with that?" His face registered the old sorrow. "I would have lived in gratitude and guilt," he said. "I would have paid that debt in ways I cannot calculate, but I would never have lied to you. That is the difference, Sarah." Their conversation ramified into logistics and ethics. They spoke of the metaphysics without the heavy scaffolding of jargon, bindings that could be created by vows, balances that sought expression through accelerated seasons, release that required not a technical reversal, but a sincere revocation. The rules were simple in their moral clarity. Consent was the currency. Withdrawal required the sincerity of a heart unbound. Mechanically, there were consequences. Pain, the tearing sensation Alex described once like a cord snapped, but Sarah resisted treating his account as an abstract. "Do you know how long you've been here?" she asked finally. He hesitated, not from guile, but from the old worn places that held memories. "A long time," he said. "Long enough to have learned that speech can wound more than silence." She was struck by the fact that he never offered dates, never threw centuries like trophies. There was no swagger in him, only the tired bearing of someone bearing hours. Sarah had met men who confected history into charm. Alex did not do that. His loneliness seemed at times less like affectation, and more like a form of discipline. He had trained himself in restraint the way a person learned to hold their breath under ice. That fact gave him a dignity she found impossible to dismiss. "But you kept this a secret until now," Sarah said. The accusation was not bitter so much as factual. "Why tell me here, with the world watching? Why not in private, so whoever loved you could still choose?" "I thought," he said, "that by telling you here I would make your choice unmistakable. I would not permit the temptation of private pressure. What I'd failed to account for was how the world would seize the narrative and use it like a blade." She nodded. In her life, she had watched how the media could turn a confession into a cudgel, how a family's quiet hurt could be transmuted into spectacle. She did not rue his decision. If anything, she saw it as another attempt at honesty, clumsy but real. Across the week that followed, the world furnished their private life with opinion and verdict. Sarah's mother drafted a statement that tried to set the story in palatable terms. Advisors counseled caution. Friends offered varying degrees of loyalty. Alex retreated and returned in fractal patterns, as if trying the edges of their new reality with ever-firm gentleness. Sarah moved through the days with the taut attention of someone learning a new language. The verbs of consent and withdrawal now belonged to her daily lexicon. Small things happened, indicators of a larger system at work. Sarah found an old photograph she had not remembered taking, where she and Alex stood at a cliff edge, hair whipped by wind, and in the background the sea appeared to boil like glass. One night she woke to feel the world rushed ahead in minor fractions. Cups on the counter seemed to have moved a hair's breadth from where she had set them the night before. Once, in the mirror, she caught the quicksilver flash of a gray hair along her temple that she was certain had not been there the previous week. Each anomaly was small, terrifying in its implication because it suggested the ledger had started to ink. When she confronted Alex, delicate as a summons, he listened like a man who kept a ledger of wounds. "Proximity," he said, "and the thing we nearly did at the altar. The binding was not executed, but the motion of desire and the public knowledge of it are forces. They leave traces." She remembered the thin seam on her wrist, and now, looking harder, she found it had extended a fraction of an inch. It was as if being in his orbit had already begun to bias her timeline. Her hand shook. In the small tremor, she felt both anger and a sharp, personal grief. This would not be a neat problem to be solved by lawyers. The calculus here would bruise the intimate parts of a life. "Then we have to draw boundaries," she said, and her tone had the kind of constancy that carries the weight of contracts. "For my sake." He agreed. They drew lines like architects. No sudden trips to remote places where no one could bear witness. No vows in informal moments. Clarity about touch and closeness. Alex honored these lines with the precision of ascetic practice. He let her set the shape of their contact, and for a while the rules looked like remedy. But rules cannot bind metaphysics entirely. There are forces whose arithmetic does not respond entirely to human craft. One evening, after a board meeting at which Sarah had applauded a modest grant to a new gallery, she returned home and found the seam on her wrist had deepened into a faint pale cord, like the memory of a string pressed under the skin. It glowed, not bright so much as patient, a thread that hummed when the room was still. Sarah pressed at it as if a hand might undo the knitting in the flesh. Pain flared, not sharp but ancient, a pulling like a tide tugging at something anchored. She called Alex without thinking. He arrived in minutes, as if the map of him had a line that connected to that sound. He looked at her hand with something like a compassionate ferocity. "You didn't consent," he said, "but the motion was enough. My presence in your life creates an imbalance the world notices. You tried to say no in public and in private, and yet certain things began to echo." "Echo how long?" she asked. "Hard to say," he answered. "The tether accelerates time when it needs to equate its presence. It's not predictable in the way a machine is predictable. It follows patterns of intimacy and recognition." The metaphors slid across each other, bridges, mathematical bonds, debts, and Sarah dismissed them one by one until only the concrete remained. Her hand, the thread beneath her skin, the possibility that simply being near him would hollow out small decades. "What do you want from me?" she asked again, but this time the question was less about statements and more about life. He met her without any flinching. "I want you to choose," he said simply. "Not because I want to possess you, but because I have spent long enough learning that choices made without eyes open are cruel. I am asking, not demanding." She imagined the long road in front of her, years that might thin faster if she remained, the slow attrition of ordinary time if she walked away, an existence with his company that would be steady with the knowledge of what it cost. The moral calculus bore no easy resolution. In Sarah's mind, the ledger remained stubbornly, painfully alive. At night, she lay awake and let the city breathe her in. She thought of ordinary pleasures, the way the morning tasted of coffee and sunlight on a terrace, the banal virtue of a life aware of its time. She thought of Alex's loneliness and how it made him human in its very ache. She thought of her mother and how shame and social expectation had brokered so many of her most intimate decisions. She thought finally of agency, of how often women like her were taught to consent by default, their options narrowed not by violence but by narratives of duty. In the small hours, she made a decision that was not yet ready to be named for anyone else. She would not allow a superficial answer at the cathedral or a hasty retreat to be the final form of what they might be to each other. She would gather facts, test the boundaries of his claim, watch the seam beneath her skin, and then she would choose. She would do so because silence or spectacle had no place in the calculus of a life. The next morning brought a message on her phone, a headline drafted with the bluntness of a hungry machine. Sarah did not open it. Instead, she rose, dressed not for ceremony but for a kind of siege. Meetings with doctors who were discreet and clever, a historian who knew of old myths that mirrored Alex's account, and a small circle of friends who could act as witnesses to the life she would choose on her terms. She would surround herself with other kinds of knowledge, lawyers, physicians, people who spoke in calendars and meters, but she would not let the world decide the ethics for her. That was the lesson from the cathedral. Spectacle could not replace consent. As she prepared to meet with the first of her confidants, she felt the hush again. Not quite the hush of the cathedral, but the miniature stillness that arrives when a person realizes the slope of their life has altered. Alex stood by the window, looking down at the city, his silhouette like a historic portrait. He did not come forward. He had learned gentleness, and he had learned to keep his hands in sight so that they would not be misread as the hands of one who reached to hold another hostage. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, "I will accept." Sarah considered the words. There was a sincerity in them that did not attempt to bind. He was offering for once a true gift, the relinquishment of hold, gift and loss braided in that offer. The choice shimmered ahead of her like a long coastline, rocky, uneven, not at all the smooth beach of romantic stories. She raised her wrist to the pale light, watched the faint cord thread like a seam beneath her skin, and felt the pressure of a decision finally arriving like weather. The world might want a headline. It might demand an easy answer. Sarah, who had made a life out of deliberate choices, would give none. She would not be hurried into the shape of another's remedy. If love required possession, she thought, then she would not offer it as handcuffs. If love offered freedom, perhaps then it would be a thing she could choose. A soft vibration began under her palm, a hum that matched the one in the cathedral and in the penthouse mirror. It was small but insistent, like the sound from a well that had finally decided to speak. She placed her fingers against the seam and felt the faint give, as if a chord measured her pulse in a language only it understood. "Come with me," she said at last. Not a command, but an invitation with edges. "Let us find out what this is. Together." He rose without hesitation. For a long moment they stood facing each other in a room that held the smell of old money and new trouble. Sarah felt, curiously, neither triumphant nor defeated. She felt instead the narrow satisfaction of a woman who had decided she would not be either victim or martyr. She would be an actor in her own story. They left the penthouse together, moving in the city as a pair newly hesitant. Cameras lurked like small predatory birds. Sarah felt the low hum pull at her wrist, and with it, a sudden clarity. The world had begun to count against her. The vibration traveled up the arm like a subtle toll, as if some distant bell had been struck and the resonance found its way into bone. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself map the sensation, the seam under her skin, the faint thread of light pulsing in measure with that sound. It was not simply phenomenon, it was an accounting. They moved through the city with a cautious choreography now, witnesses discreetly placed, friends who consented to ask neutral questions, a physician who preferred to say he would observe rather than diagnose. Sarah, trained in the art of preparedness, collected expertise the way others collected friends, for use, for testimony, for the quiet authority of someone who could make their life language legible to others. She convened a small circle, an immunologist who respected the unexplainable, an antiquarian whose knowledge bordered on the mythic, a structural psychologist who kept closing notes in a sensible small notebook. They met in rooms with good light and furniture that did not intrude into the conversation. She wanted air that could hold facts. At first, the tests were practical. Blood work that returned the soft, indifferent answers of labs, scans that found nothing dramatic, markers that read ordinary. The clinicians smiled with the professional calm Sarah had seen 1,000 times. An effect could be real even when instruments failed to name it. Her wrist showed no external bruise. The thread beneath the surface remained a private phenomenon, visible only by the thin way it breathed under skin. The humming could not be isolated by machine, though it was insistently present to human senses. The antiquarian brought a different currency. Tales that were less history than pattern, stories that recurred in older languages. He spoke softly of bonds made by intention, of pacts whose economy was not paper but time. He did not say his stories were proof, he said they were echoes, and echoes mattered when one needed a metaphoric frame for a reality too large for a laboratory. The historian's voice was careful. There were records, he said, of marriages whose notional vows were taken as compacts by certain societies where oaths were indexed to the seasons. The details were airy and not precise. His value lay in reminding Sarah that the world had long tried to narrate the mysterious. "These are metaphors," the doctor told her one afternoon, fingers steepled, the kind of reasonable face that made it hard to panic. "But people have always used metaphors to make ethical sense of what they cannot measure." Sarah liked that. Metaphor could be organized, negotiated. It could be translated into rules and boundaries. Where the science failed, the ledger of story could at least help her parse options. Alex listened to all of it with the same restraint he brought to other aspects of his life. He did not try to charm the doctors with upbringing or titles. He answered questions plainly, as if he were a witness in a court where the currency was truth rather than image. Sarah found herself watching him more than the test results. The more she observed, the more she saw a man cataloging his speech to avoid cheapening what had already cost him. They tried experiments of proximity and distance, of measured encounters and supervised separations, a day together in a monitored apartment, an afternoon apart with watches set and friends to witness the hours, nights each in their own rooms while phones pinged with timestamps. Each trial revealed something small and stubborn. Near him, the humming insisted in the bones. Away from him for long stretches, the seam in her wrist dimmed as if tired of the strain. It was not neat or linear. The tether, where it showed itself, behaved like a mood more than a machine, restless, responsive to intimacy and recognition. The effect had begun even without vows, the world around had noticed, and the tally had begun. When she pressed him for history in the privacy of her kitchen, the question came stripped of spectacle. "How did you survive it?" she asked, more curious than accusatory, the clink of cutlery underlining the ordinary ordinariness of the question. He looked at the window as if the street could answer. "By keeping whatever I could from wanting more life out of others' days," he said. "By rigorous restraint. By removing myself when I could. By not courting those entanglements that would invite the ledger." "Which is why you told me," Sarah said. "Because I could no longer be certain I was succeeding," he admitted. "And because you deserved the truth." He did not beg. He did not argue. He offered the plain facts and allowed the moral calculus to rest where it must, on her. Despite the guarded rhythm of their new life, the world outside remained a trawl of appetite. Social pages churned the story into night, editorialists writing about a scandal and a parable, some commentators deciding on villainy, others on a love that was doomed from mystical beginnings. Calls came and were politely managed. Sarah, who had once sat on boards and moderated reputations, found herself wondering how many of those voices would ever confront their own ledgers. Weeks passed with small accelerations that added up. A photograph at an event showed a line near her temple more pronounced than she'd expected. Friends remarked on a certain keenness in her face that suggested long wakefulness. Once she missed a flight because the world had simply arrived sooner for her. By the time she left her apartment, an hour that should have matched the city's was already a day ahead in her sense. It was a sting of perception that was less dramatic than it might have been, and therefore harder to protest against. The tether took in increments that were intimate and rude. They tried containment with the precision of two people who had learned to draft agreements. They delineated the edges of touch and speech, set limits on days spent together, invented rituals of checking in with friends, witnesses to presence. For a time, that worked. Alex lived within the lines she drew with an almost ascetic fidelity. He would stand at a door, wait for her to invite him in, and leave when she asked. It was a discipline born of long apprenticeship. But the ledger had momentum. It did not respect contracts as easily as hearts do. One evening, after a quiet dinner where they had spoken of small domestic things, the way certain cheeses smelled, a painting Sarah wanted to donate, the hum grew urgent. Sarah rose to clear their plates and found herself dizzy in a precise, nauseous way. She watched the city beyond the window tilt, not in vision, but in the interior sense of time. The streetlights were already on, though only minutes ago the sky had been violet. She touched her wrist. The seam pulsed like a held breath. "Now?" she asked, the question stripped of curiosity. Her voice was steady in spite of the ache that threaded the back of her mouth. Alex came to her and did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was small and steady. "It is a tide," he said. "Sometimes the ledger counts with a slow fairness. Sometimes it takes in waves." "Will it end?" she asked. He closed his eyes. "It ends only if you unmake the currency it was measured with," he said. "And that is your choice to make." She thought of consent as currency, and of the ledger it created. That night she lay awake and set the terms she had to meet. She would not allow the world to decide. She would not let pity or coercion from 1,000 strangers, or the worn coercion of her mother's disappointment, force a decision she did not own. If she was to choose, she would do it with all the clarity she could muster. In the hours before dawn, she mapped an ending she would not evade, a sincere revocation. Preparing for the revocation was less a technical exercise than a moral one. Sarah understood instinctively that sincerity could not be feigned. It was the hinge the metaphysics required. The reading had told them that release demanded unequivocal renunciation, the kind that came from a place unclouded by love's clinging, by spectacle's pressure, by fear. It was, in short, a decision whose efficacy was measured by its purity. The idea pulled her inward with a kind of vertigo, to love and to unbind, to give freedom as the final act of devotion. They planned nothing rhetorical. There would be no public theater. Sarah refused any stage. She wanted a private removal, witnessed only by the two of them and the narrow sensibility of those who understood what it meant. They agreed on a place fittingly simple, a room in the countryside, far from lenses and polished reputations, with a window that looked out over a field of winter grass and an old wall of glass panes that would take the light and refrain from judgment. On the morning chosen, the air had that brittle clarity the city stole from the countryside, the sort of cold that left edges sharp and words crisp. Sarah dressed herself not for ceremony but for truth. An unadorned dress, her hair tied back, no jewelry to distract the eye. When she reached for Alex's hand, it was to anchor herself, not to save him. He did not try to dissuade her. If anything, his face held the weight of someone who had been given a gift he had been taught to fear. "Tell me what you will do," he asked, as if rehearsal might shelter them from shock. "I will revoke my consent," she said simply. "I will name that what you are, what the ledger demands, cannot be paid with my years." "Say it in your own words," he requested. Sarah inhaled, feeling the cold as something that clarified rather than numbed. She thought of the seam under her skin and the small way it had been knitting faster than a calendar ought to allow. She thought of mornings coffeeless, of birthdays she might miss, of grandchildren who would arrive sooner than they ought. She thought of his centuries of solitude and the cost they had won in other people's loss. Love, she decided, could be measured most honestly by what it renounced. "I withdraw my consent," she said, and her voice was not flamboyant, only true. "I release you from any claim your existence may attempt to make on my life. I do not consent to a bargain that requires the shortening of my time. I free you to live as you must, but not by stealing the measure of me." The words settled between them like a small, cool judgment. For a moment nothing happened but the ordinary sound of breath and the distant ticking of a clock. Then the room shifted. It began as a tightening inside Sarah's sternum, the kind of internal constriction that is the body's oldest language for danger. Sensations layered themselves quickly, a pressure like wind tightening into a knot, a pulling that traveled down each limb as if invisible hands were trying to draw something out. She tried to steady herself, to breathe with the measured calm she had practiced in many crises. The breath would not anchor. The seam in her wrist flared until it seemed to be a luminous cord visible through the skin. Alex reached for her, and for the first time in all the tests and boundaries and careful words, his control broke into something raw. "Sarah," he whispered. His hands were at her face then, and his thumb brushed the line at her temple with a tenderness that made her want to deny the pain simply to spare his look. "It's okay," she said, though she did not know if it was. The truth was that the pain was unbearable and precise, not the bluntness of violence, but the interior incision of change. Images, quick as film, paraded through her mind. Years she had not yet lived, visits and dinners, the slow softening of laughter into something more private. She saw herself in photographs that had not yet been taken, and then, with equal clarity, their faces faded and then regained like film scratched and then repaired. The world seemed to both thin and thicken in succession. Time was rearranging itself. A sound filled the room, not quite a wind and not exactly a voice. The hum made flesh. It rose to a high note that played against her teeth. Her legs buckled. Alex's body shuddered as if struck. Where he stood, the air around him seemed to writhe. The edges of his silhouette blurred into a grayness that suggested separation rather than absence. "Do not hold me back," he said through a voice shredded by whatever translation the moment required. "Do not give me love that is a cage. If your choice is freedom, then give me what freedom you can." She did not hesitate. The sincerity the metaphysics demanded was not a cold procedure. It was an all-in giving. Sarah let every possession she had collected, image, fear, habit, fall away. She thought of the small acts of her life she loved most, and how they did not need him to be such as they were. She thought of the quiet, ordinary days she had saved away in corners of her mind. She roasted them up like bread, held them against her chest as proof that life could be itself. Then she said the last thing she would say to him in that form: "Be free. Live the way you must without my years." The sound in the room escalated, a wind that sang like glass. For Alice, it had been a metaphor. For Sarah, the glass was real, and the singing a language. She felt something pull outward from within, an ache like a wound opening, and then the keening relief of a bind unmade. It was pain, yes, but also a wrenching that made space. Alex's body went through a transformation that was visible and terrible in its beauty. He thinned at the edges as if time itself had been folded away from him. For a terrible, luminous second, Sarah saw him both as he had been and as he had become. Centuries of restraint flayed in a glance. As he receded, he did not disappear into emptiness but into a between that had weight. He left a trail of cold that washed across Sarah's face and then withdrew like an ocean. A gust of air rose and then the world reasserted its gravity. Chairs scraped, an old clock resumed its patient tick, snow on the far field brightened like salt. Sarah collapsed into a chair, hands on her knees, the physical world suddenly immediate and real again. Her wrist ached as if she had run with the tide, but the seam under the skin was gone, or at least it had retreated into a pale memory. Her breath came ragged, then steadier, as if time itself had released its grip. She tasted metal and the salt of tears she had not thought to call. Alex was not gone in the sense of annihilation. He lay on the floor, not where he had stood, and then he rose with the effort of someone who had been torn from a long habit and needed to relearn the use of limbs. His face was altered, not grotesquely, but palpably. The centuries had left marks in the way he held his jaw, in the way his fingers trembled, in the intangibles of posture. He moved like a man who had been given a new measure. They did not speak at first. When words found them, they were small and exact. "I am sorry," he said. It was not an apology for the metaphysics. There was nothing to be sorry for in the laws of whatever fracture had birthed him, but for the way he had asked, for the weight he had placed at her door. "You told me," Sarah said. Her voice was a dry instrument of practicality. And then it began. "I am not punishing you. I am making the clean choice I should have been allowed to make." He nodded, and then he did something gentle and deliberate. He pressed his forehead to hers. It was a contact neither possessive nor needy. It was an ancient benediction exchanged between two people who had survived an ordeal. In the days that followed, the small signs of the tether eased. The odd rush of time that had ambushed her retreated into memory. Sarah still recognized the faint, indelible wear in her skin. Closely studied photographs would later show a line of premature strain in a certain year. But the active, humming pull that had dictated her days was no longer an assailant. She slept nights that matched clocks and calendars. She could plan for weeks without the private terror of days skipping ahead. Alex did not stay precisely as he had been. The release had cost him something palpable, a loss of the peculiar stillness that had been part of his otherness. He could not step into the old cadence of centuries and remain untouched. He carried instead a new fragility, the precise awareness of the measured time he had been given. There were nights he slept with a simple, honest exhaustion, and mornings where the novelty of a cup of coffee and the warmth of a blanket seemed to astonish him like a small miracle. His presence in Sarah's life changed shape. Without the tether's accounting, his desire to possess dissipated. What remained was a person learning again to be human in the small domestic ways. The blessing of not being able to time his grief out of existence, the need to wake to hunger, the simple annoyance of catching a cold. These were small, ennobling indignities that made him more legible to ordinary compassion. Sarah watched him relearn the craft of living under a fragile schedule and admired the humility with which he accepted the trade. Her mother was not easily made softer. There was, in the weeks after, a brittle repair of public narratives. Statements were released, reputations patched. Sarah refused to craft a triumphant story. Instead, she insisted on a version that spoke of difficult truth and mutual dignity. The press cycled through outrage and pity, and then, fatigued, moved on. Sarah accepted the attention with the same calm she had once used to manage donations, as another fact to be factored. Years advanced in a rhythm both tender and ordinary. Sarah took up matters she had long loved, philanthropy with a new urgency, programs that attended to artists without patrons, foundations that protected small, fragile things. She aged in the way of someone who had been given back her days, with a patience she had not known before, and with a new distaste for the synthetic shine of appearances. Her hair threaded through with silver, laugh lines deepened into proofs of living. She learned to wear these marks as evidence of a life kept, rather than as blemishes to be concealed. Alex made his own life, tentative and astonishing in its small pleasures. He traveled in ways he had not allowed himself. He learned the discomfort and sweetness of losing things to time and not regaining them. He built no palaces. He took rooms as needed and slept. He found a job, small, practical work that taxed his attention, restoring old books, arranging bindings, caring for things that themselves had been stitched through time. There was poetry in the way his hands, once instruments of a man who had catalogued centuries, now mended pages. They visited each other sometimes in ordinary seasons. Coffee in the morning, a gallery opening, a quiet meal with a friend who was careful with questions. They no longer spoke in the clipped, careful phrases of people negotiating metaphysical law. Instead, they exchanged quiet observations. A remark about the taste of a certain bread, a rueful joke about market reports, the small triumph of fixing a leaky tap. Love shaded into companionship, stripped of ownership. 2 decades carved themselves into Sarah's face and into the count of the world around them. Her philanthropic projects multiplied in influence, not spectacle. The foundation she guided became a place that sheltered marginal voices with the same ferocity she had once used to defend her private life. She taught young women in small seminars how to negotiate their own autonomy, how to keep both life and trade with dignity. She never branded her story into lesson-sold mysticism. She told it with sparing honesty when invited, reminding people that liberty is often won in private acts of refusal. In time, the city that had once watched her with hunger softened its appetite. Photos of Sarah no longer commanded covers. The ledger that had once totaled her life into spectacle had turned its numbers elsewhere. Her mother passed in a quiet winter filled with reconciled letters and a certain tidy regret. Sarah attended the funeral with hands that had been strong enough to both refuse and forgive. She sat in the pew and thought of the narrowness of other people's expectations. She kept one small ritual. On the anniversary of the cathedral morning, she visited the countryside field where she'd made the irrevocable choice. She stood before the same window pane and let the wind tell her what it would. The seam that had once marked her skin had faded to a paler memory. What remained was the knowledge that a life could be chosen and that choosing could be an act of love in itself. On an autumn afternoon that smelled of apples and the specific melancholy of long shadows, she received a letter that would be the softest shock of her later years. It was not a public missive, but a private one. handmade, with edges browned as if time had already been generous with its gentleness. The handwriting was familiar though changed, stabler than the long-ago scripts Alex had used to sign gala patronage lists. It bore tremors at the edges that spoke of years worn into the hand. He had returned, he wrote simply, in language that had trimmed the old theatricality into something small and human. He had lived in moons and coasts, worked with hands that had learned their limits, and realized with the kind of humility that only the finite can teach, that the life he had now was a single beautiful, fragile currency. He asked if she wished to see her one more time. Sarah read the letter in the afternoon light and let it settle on the table like a small, honest thing. She could have said no. She could have let memory remain unreckoned. Instead, she wrote back with the directness she had always cultivated and arranged for him to come. He arrived not as the man who had once been sustained by fractures, but as a person softened and steadied by time. There was a weather about him that was not sorrow, but the consequence of choosing days, a gentleness in the way he moved, the precise pleasure he took in ordinary foods, a laugh that had gained a tremor of surprise. His hair was thinner, his hands slightly knuckled, but his eyes had that same honest clarity Sarah had first encountered in Zurich. They did not speak of old metaphysics in grand terms. There was no need. They spoke of small things, a book he had mended, a place he had visited that had an extraordinary light, the ridiculous satisfaction of being able to sleep through a whole night without waking to measure time. Sarah told him about the foundation, about the artist now able to show because of a grant she had insisted on. He listened like someone learning the shape of a life he had once tried to bind. In the months that followed, Sarah's health softened in ways that were not dramatic but steady. A doctor, young and efficient, placed tests and prescriptions, explained things in terms of modern advantage and small frustrations. Sarah accepted the measurements. There were days she felt the decline like a weather system, gray and inevitable, and, in its continuity, not without strange comforts. Her last winter arrived with a quiet that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with the small domestic truths she had chosen to cherish. The bed had soft sheets, and the window looked toward a street where the leaves had fallen into honest piles. Alex came often by then. He had learned the bedside arts with the same humility he had learned to mend bindings, how to make tea at a heat she liked, how to hold a hand so that it felt neither too light nor too heavy, how to speak of the past without claiming it as currency. They did not rehearse a grand final speech. Instead, in the slow hours when light thinned, they sat and let the world be what it always had been, an accumulation of small days. He would read aloud sometimes from worn pages, and when he did, his voice was a modest miracle, steady and grateful. Sarah listened and sometimes nodded. Sometimes she whispered something imperfectly witty, and sometimes she closed her eyes and opened them again to find him there. And that was enough. On the last morning that Sarah would count as hers, the air held that brittle clarity she had once found at the countryside window. Sun slanted across the room and caught in the glass like a film of old light. Alex sat by the bed, holding her hand with a revere.